Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This week we're wrapping up The Buddha in the Attic, written by Julie Otsuka. Last week where we left off, the women were very depressed and handling everything as strong and willful as they possibly can, diving themselves into their work, whatever work it may have been, just forgetting about home that they left back behind in Japan. The second portion of the book, as I began reading, took a dive into the families and the women being pregnant and having their children. It was very beautiful to read because it was as if the women found themselves yet again. Now I'd like to read a passage from the book. Some of them were stubborn and willful and would not listen to a word we said. Others were more serene than the Buddha. He came into the world smiling. One loved her father more than anyone else. One hated bright colors. One would not go anywhere without his tin pail. One weaned herself at the age of 13 months by pointing to a glass of milk on the counter and telling us, "I want." Several were wise beyond their years. The fortune teller told us he was born with the soul of an old man. They ate at the table like grown-ups. They never cried. They never complained. They never left their chopsticks standing upright in their rice. They played by themselves all day long without making a sound, while we worked nearby in the fields. They drew pictures in the dirt for hours, and whenever we tried to pick them up and carry them home, they shook their heads and said, "I'm too heavy," or "Mama, rest." They were worried about us when we were tired. They worried about us when we were sad. They knew without our telling them when our knees were bothering us or it was our time of the month. They slept with us at night like puppies on wooden boards covered with hay. And for the first time since coming to America, we did not mind having someone else beside us in the bed. Someone truly saw them for who they were. Even though it's a mother and a child, and a mother always has a tendency to put on her best face, the child still sees them for who they are. It may not be the full picture, but it was at this moment where they were comfortable. At this moment in America, they have their home. The children are normal. They have questions pertaining to life. Curiosity doesn't change amongst the cultures. In fact, it's just shown in different lights. And it's very unique to them because of the type of lifestyle that they lived. But it wasn't until the kids got older where they started seeing and feeling like outsiders, and they found it was better for them to acclimate to American culture. And by doing that, a lot of their practices as kids were in a way renouncing their own heritage and not disowning it, but putting it away in a box where they felt it belonged so they can feel like they belong. The book reads, they learned which mothers would let them come over. Mrs. Hankey, Mrs. Woodruff, Mrs. Alfred, and which would not, all the other mothers. They learned which barbers would cut their hair, the Negro barbers, and which barbers to avoid, the grumpy barbers on the south side of Grove. They learned that there were certain things that would never be theirs: higher noses, fair complexions, longer legs that might be noticed from afar. Every morning I do my stretching exercises, but it doesn't seem to help. They learned when they could go swimming at the YMCA, colored days or on Mondays, and when they could go to the picture show at the Pantages Theater downtown. Never. They learned that they should always call the restaurant first. Do you serve Japanese? They learned not to go out alone during the daytime and what to do if they found themselves cornered in an alley after dark. Just tell them you know judo. And if that didn't work, they learned to fight back with their fists. They respect you when you're strong. They learned to find protectors. They learned to hide their anger. No, of course, I don't mind. That's fine, go ahead. They learned never to show their fear. They learned that some people are born luckier than others. that things in this world do not always go as you plan. The early 1900s, around 1920s, 1930s, this was a very racist time to think that you couldn't even go over your friend's house because you weren't white, you know? And still to this day, we're dealing with racism in its evolved form. And it's sad to think of how deep and how everyone is affected in this culture, in this society, down from the kids who are learning the hate to the kids who are experiencing it. With even knowing how deep and how racist America can be and the limitations that were presented to their children, the parents still let the kids dream. The book reads, "Still they dreamed. One swore she would one day marry a preacher so she wouldn't have to pick berries on Sundays. One wanted to save up enough money to buy his own farm. One wanted to become a tomato grower like his father. One wanted to become anything but. One wanted to plant a vineyard. One wanted to start his own label. One wanted to become a doctor. One wanted to become his sister. One wanted to become a gangster. One wanted to become a star. And even though we saw the darkness coming, we said nothing and let them dream." Parents always seem to see the end result quicker than we do. And when I read, we let them dream even though we saw what was going to happen. My mind instantly went to what's going to happen because, again, this is in the early 1900s. So I'm not really familiar prior to this book with anything from this culture at this time other than bits and pieces, thanks to like The Great Gatsby. I semi know what the culture was, but the book goes on to explain exactly what the darkness was that they were going to experience. The book touches the beginning of World War II. Now, if you're unfamiliar, this is when America experienced the tragic events during Pearl Harbor, where Pearl Harbor was blown up and America was in war with Japan. And again, this book is about Japanese picture brides' migration to America, finding and looking for the American dream. And this is the 1940s at this point, late 1930s, 1940s, where World War II began and America started changing narratives from being a safe haven to keeping an eye out for your next door neighbor who might be harboring weapons or intel or being a spy. And as you can imagine, the entire dynamic from being racist and semi-unwelcoming to becoming very unwelcoming, and you have to watch everything you do more so because you might be taken away, which in fact happened. There was talk of a list that emerged in various towns about how people are being accused of being spies for Japan. And because of this, men started to mysteriously go missing. And in the beginning, it was infrequently and not close to home. So the stories they were hearing about men being taken, it would be of a farmer miles and miles away. So although many people were hearing the rumors, they weren't solidified yet because it would be of a third person. But then as the war became more serious, more and more people were starting to disappear. This change in the atmosphere almost happened overnight because of the events with the war, and it affected children as well. The children being so innocent, some of them had gotten their parents taken away because they would mention things like, "We have something big brewing up, you have no idea," but it would be in response to a bully attacking them, or it would be just common talk because the kid didn't understand the severity of the situation, which typically kids don't. And they mentioned a comment here or there that would spark worry in the teachers, and they would pull the kids aside, have an intense conversation with the kid, trying to pull as much intel as possible, and that actually caused a few parents to be taken away. The Japanese Americans were under an enormous amount of stress regarding this because there weren't clear guidelines on what constituted being a spy. And it was at this point where the division fell within their own community. Now, if you can remember from the first video on this, there was such an emphasis on comfort. The very little comfort that these people were experiencing was in knowing and being able to speak to one another and have fun and experience some sort of normalcy between one another, because it would remind them of their home country. But they couldn't even speak to each other anymore at this point because they were fearful of being considered spies. This was just starting to become their home. And then it was all taken away from them in a blink of an eye because of what was going on in Japan. And although I can understand where as a country under attack, where we would take precautions, what really hurts is to think an entire culture is being targeted because of what's happening outside of our country. But the reason why I was brought inward into the country was because there were few people found that were in cahoots with the enemy at the time, Japan. And because of this, that's what really sparked the separation between our communities and our culture. They became very, very silent. Now, before in the beginning of the book, we saw how silent the women were and how the men taught the women to be, which also in a way was very silent and not very open about their emotions. But because of the war, it created such a divide that they became more secluded in their own bubble with their own family, trying to stay afloat and not associate themselves with the negative ideals that were being pushed upon them. Because of this, a lot of people felt the need to disassociate with being a Japanese American, and some people were walking around with pins that said "I am Chinese," because there's enough issue with being anything other than the typical American, what used to be the typical American. And as you can see in the beginning, you saw how racist it really was. So not only are you dealing with the constant racism and having to check, and you can't live your everyday life because you're not accepted in many of the places, if anywhere at all, so you have to make the extra step in finding out where you can walk freely. And not only that are you dealing with, but you're dealing with people assuming that you are there in conspiracy against their government. That just created such a tear in the hearts of the people who finally found their home, finally found their place, were building, and it was all stripped from them. The narrative in the book seems to make a shift. No longer is the book talking as we, meaning the picture bride, but we and us as the families. If you were considered to be a spy because America was being very careful with the way that they were approaching the war, they decided to take people slowly but surely into these camps, into this area where they were being held. And this book doesn't touch upon the exact experiences they were having away. At that point, once they were taken away, the book changes narrative again into the perspective of the Americans. The communities affected by the Japanese disappearance were so devastated for quite a while because nothing was ever explained to anyone on any aspect of the disappearance. From the very early stages when people were starting to disappear one by one, all the way to the mass disappearance of the Japanese people in our communities back in the 1940s or so, that wasn't relayed properly to the public on what was going on. There was so much misunderstanding with what was actually going to be happening that the Japanese people who were being taken, most of them didn't even know how long this was going to take. There was a woman in the book who even said that she brought along a book with her because it's due next week. So she assumed that she was going to be back in time to return her library book. And that just translated across the board, because not only were the Japanese not informed on how long they were going to be taken away, but the Americans who come to love them, although the culture is very racist and very divided, there's such a love, as you can see, and appreciation for their existence. Nothing's perfect, especially not in the beginning, and we know America has a lot of flaws with accepting other cultures, even though that's literally what we're built on, but it's not perfect, and this is what we deal with. But when the mass disappearance happened, there was such a ghost-like, eerie feeling in the communities when they left. I would like to read a passage from the book that just explains how strong they had to be to deal with this mass disappearance the way they did, because not only was the government not explaining what was going to be happening, but the Japanese took it upon themselves to handle it with grace. They didn't panic abruptly and loudly. They simply prepared in silence. For several weeks, some of us continued to hold out hope that the Japanese might return, because nobody said it would be forever. We looked for them at the bus stop, at the florist, as we're walking past the radio repair shop on 2nd Avenue, formerly known as Nagamatsu Fish. We glance at our windows repeatedly just in case our gardeners have snuck back unannounced into our yards. There's always a slight chance Yoshi might be out there raking leaves. We wonder if it wasn't somehow all our fault. Perhaps we should have petitioned the mayor, the governor, the president himself. Please let them stay. Or simply knocked on their doors and offered to help. If only, we say to ourselves, we'd known. But the last time any of us saw Mr. Mori at the fruit stand, he was just as friendly as ever. He never mentioned to me that he was going away, one woman says. 3 days later, however, he was gone. A cashier at the Associated Market says that the day before the Japanese appeared, they were stocking up on food like there was no tomorrow. One woman says she bought more than 20 of Vienna sausages. I didn't think to ask her why. Now, of course, she wishes she had. I just want to know they're all right. This book doesn't touch on the experiences at the camps or what they went through. But as you can see in today's culture, they were brought back, and it was over a year later that we would start to see families back into our communities and reacclimated. It was a terrible time, and I did see an interview with Julia Tsuka where she speaks with another man who happened to be a child at the time when they were sent off to the camps. And he does say that his family never spoke about it. And when they came back and they were asked, "Where did you go?" they simply brushed it off and would respond with very simple answers such as vacation. Teachers missed their students, customers missed the owners. They mattered so much, and I don't think that was ever properly relayed. But from my mouth to yours, thank you for being so strong and surviving the way you did. I am so grateful that we have people like Julia Atsuka to open our eyes as Americans and learn about different cultures and what our society tends to do to bodies of people. And although it was within some right, because there was a war happening and there were people found to be in cahoots with the enemy at the time, I do feel that I can only imagine what lack of information and communication did to further divide this country. Once again, this was The Buddha in the Attic. This concludes our first book of the book club. I will say that towards the end it gets a bit chaotic because Julie does a great job with connecting the reader with the actual mindset of the Japanese at the time. So if you stick it through, then you get to the part where it's more calm and more settled and you can follow the story better. But that portion, it ends with the Americans and how they can feel the emptiness without the rest of their community members. If you're interested, again, please feel free to go into the description box down below and you can get your own version of the book on Amazon. And if you're interested in any more content like this, please hit that like button so I know. Also, if you have any book recommendations, feel free to join my Discord or simply comment down below and tell me what book you'd like me to read next. Blessings from mine to yours. Make sure you stay safe and thank you so much for sticking around. Sayonara. Hey there, nice to meet you. This is VoiceOver Annie. Shout out to Dynamite Heart for the beautiful artwork. If you're interested in having your art piece possibly being shown in next week's episode, feel free to join the Discord where you can drop your art in the art category. There's a link in the description down below. See you next week. Bye!